was standing in our kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd prepared thousands of meals, where I'd celebrated his every achievement while quietly burying my own dreams. The pan was still sizzling on the stove, the scent of garlic and onions filling the air, but all I could hear were his words echoing in my mind like a death sentence. You need to give up the position, Sarah. Natalie deserves this opportunity more than you do. Natalie, 24 years old, fresh out of graduate school, with her perfect smile and her way of looking at my husband, like he was the answer to every question she'd ever had. My husband, who was supposed to be mine, who had promised me forever when we were young and stupid and believed that love could conquer anything. The same man who was now asking me to hand over the job I'd been working toward for almost a decade. The position that represented everything I'd sacrificed, everything I'd given up to support his career. The university had a spousal quota system. When one partner got hired, the other could apply for available positions within their field. It was meant to help academic couples stay together, to prevent the brutal two-body problem that tore so many relationships apart. I had been waiting for this moment for 8 years, watching as David climbed the ladder while I remained in the background, editing his papers, organizing his research, managing his schedule, playing the perfect academic wife while my own ambitions withered in the shadow of his success. And now, when the position had finally opened up, when it was my turn to step into the light, he wanted me to step aside for her, for the woman who had been sleeping in our bed whenever I was away visiting my sick mother, for the woman who wore my perfume and used my coffee mug, and probably laughed about how pathetic I was, how easily manipulated, how completely unaware of what was happening right under my nose. But I wasn't unaware anymore. The moment that oil hit my skin, something shifted, like a fog lifting, like stepping out of a dark room into blazing sunlight. I could see everything with perfect clarity. Now, every lie, every manipulation, every time he'd made me feel guilty for wanting something for myself, every time he'd convinced me that my dreams were selfish, that a good wife puts her husband's career first, that there would be time for me later, always later, when he was more established, when the timing was better, when the stars aligned just right. We can get divorced temporarily, he was saying, still talking as if this was a reasonable conversation, as if he wasn't asking me to destroy my life for his convenience. Just on paper. You know how the system works. If we're divorced, Natalie can get the position without any issues, and then in 3 years, when she's established, we can remarry. It's just a formality, Sarah. You understand, don't you? I understood perfectly. I understood that he had planned this, probably for months. I understood that every time he told me he loved me, every time he'd promised that my turn was coming, every time he'd made me feel like we were a team, it had all been a lie. I understood that to him. I wasn't a wife. I wasn't a partner. I wasn't even a person. I was just a convenience, a support system, a placeholder until something better came along. The burn on my wrist was nothing compared to the fire that was building inside my chest. Not anger, exactly, though there was plenty of that. Something colder, more dangerous. Something that felt like power, like awakening, like the death of every illusion I'd been carrying for almost a decade. I turned off the stove with movements. That felt mechanical, disconnected, like I was watching someone else control my body. The silence stretched between us, heavy and expectant. He was waiting for me to cry, I realized. Waiting for me to beg, to plead, to ask him how he could do this to me after everything I'd given up for him. Waiting for me to remind him of all the conferences I'd skipped so he could attend, all the job opportunities I'd turned down so we could move for his career, all the nights I'd spent alone while he worked late, or said he was working late. But I didn't cry. I didn't beg. Instead, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: clarity. Perfect. Crystalline clarity about exactly what I needed to do. Okay, I said. And my voice sounded strange to my own ears, calm and steady, and completely devoid of the emotion he was expecting. I'll call the university tomorrow and withdraw my application. The relief on his face was almost comical. He actually smiled. The same boyish smile that had made me fall in love with him when we were in graduate school. Together, when I thought we were building something beautiful and lasting. When I thought that supporting his dreams meant he would support mine in return. I knew you'd understand, he said, reaching for me like he wanted to touch my shoulder, to comfort me for the devastation he'd just inflicted. I stepped back before he could make contact, and something flickered across his face. Confusion, maybe, or the first hint of unease. I'll pack some things tonight. I continued in that same eerily calm voice. I'll stay at a hotel while we figure out the divorce paperwork. Sarah, wait, you don't need to. Actually, I do. I looked at him directly for the first time since the oil had burned me, since the veil had been lifted from my eyes. If we're getting divorced so your girlfriend can have my job, then we should probably start acting like people who are getting divorced, don't you think? He opened his mouth to argue, to explain, to rationalize, but I was already walking away, walking up the stairs to our bedroom, to the closet that held 8 years of my life. 8 years of careful choices made around his preferences, his schedule, his needs. I pulled out a suitcase, the same one I'd used for our honeymoon, and began filling it with the essentials. Clothes that were mine, books that belonged to me, jewelry that I'd bought for myself because he never remembered birthdays or anniversaries, or any of the small occasions that mattered to me. He followed me upstairs, of course, hovering in the doorway like he couldn't decide whether to come in or stay away. Sarah, please, you're being dramatic. This doesn't have to change anything between us. It's just a piece of paper. Just a piece of paper. Like our marriage had been just a piece of paper. Like my dreams were just unrealistic fantasies. Like my pain was just an inconvenience he needed to manage until I came to my senses and went back to being the perfect, supportive wife who never asked for anything she couldn't give herself. I folded my clothes with methodical precision, each movement deliberate and final. You're right, I said without looking at him. It is just a piece of paper, which makes it very easy to tear up. What do you mean? I mean, I'm not interested in your 3-year plan, David. I'm not interested in being your backup wife while you explore your options. I'm not interested in pretending that this marriage has been anything other than a slow suffocation for the past 8 years. That's not fair. His voice had an edge to it now. The tone he used when students challenged him in class, when his authority was questioned. I've worked hard to get where I am. We've both benefited from my success. As if there had ever been a we. As if my contributions had ever been acknowledged, credited, valued as anything more than the natural duty of a faculty wife. As if the papers I'd helped research and edit bore my name alongside his. As if the networking events I'd attended and the dinner parties I'd hosted and the small sacrifices I'd made every single day for 8 years had ever been seen as anything other than my obligation. Have we? I closed the suitcase and finally turned to face him. What exactly have I gained from your success, David? What do I have to show for 8 years of putting your career first? You have. We have a beautiful home, financial security, a life that most people would envy. I have a beautiful home that's in your name because your credit was better when we bought it. I have financial security as long as I remain married to you and continue to prioritize your needs over my own. I have a life that looks perfect from the outside and feels like a prison from the inside. He stared at me like I was speaking a foreign language, like the concept of my having independent thoughts and feelings was so alien that he couldn't process it. And maybe it was alien to him. Maybe in all the years we'd been together, he'd never actually seen me as a separate person with my own desires and ambitions. Maybe I'd been so good at being what he needed that he'd forgotten I was anything else. Where is this coming from? He asked, and there was genuine bewilderment in his voice. We've been happy. We've been a team. No, David. You've been happy. I've been useful. I picked up my suitcase and walked toward the door. He stepped aside to let me pass, and I could feel his eyes on me as I went down the stairs, as I picked up my purse and my keys from the table by the front door. The same table where I'd left countless notes for him over the years. Reminders about social obligations, grocery lists, little expressions of love and support that he'd probably barely noticed. Sarah, wait, please. Can we just talk about this? Can we figure out a way to make this work for everyone? Everyone? Meaning him and Natalie. Meaning everyone except me. There's nothing to figure out, I said, my hand on the doorknob. You've made your choice. You chose her over me, her career over mine, her happiness over our marriage. That's fine. You're entitled to make that choice. But I'm entitled to make mine too. What choice? What are you talking about? I turned back to look at him one last time. My husband of 8 years. The man I'd loved with everything I had. The man I'd built my entire adult life around. He looked smaller somehow, standing there in the hallway of the house we'd shared, surrounded by all the things we'd accumulated together, all the books we'd never read, the art we'd bought because it matched the furniture, the photographs from vacations where I'd smiled for the camera while slowly disappearing inside. I'm choosing to leave, I said simply. I'm choosing to stop waiting for you to love me the way I've loved you. I'm choosing to stop believing that if I'm just patient enough, selfless enough, perfect enough, eventually you'll see me as something more than a supporting character in your story. Sarah, you're not thinking clearly. You're upset, and rightfully so, but I'm thinking more clearly than I have in years. And with that, I walked out. Not dramatically, not with tears or screaming, or any of the emotional displays he probably expected. I simply opened the door, stepped outside into the cool evening air, and closed it behind me with a soft click. That somehow sounded more final than slamming it would have. I drove to the nicest hotel in town, the one where we'd celebrated his 10-year announcement 3 years ago, where I'd smiled and congratulated him and pretended that his success felt like our success, even though I'd been the one to edit his job talk, to proofread his application materials, to manage all the logistics of his campus visits while he focused on being brilliant and charming, and everything the search committee was looking for. The desk clerk was professional and efficient, and if she noticed that I was checking in alone, with a single suitcase and no reservation, she didn't comment. I paid for a week in advance, cash, from the small account I'd been building up from freelance editing work, money I'd been saving for something special, though I'd never been quite sure what that something would be. Now I knew. The room was beautiful, all cream and gold and soft lighting, with a view of the city skyline that I'd never taken the time to appreciate. I sat on the edge of the king-sized bed and looked out at all those lights. All those lives being lived by people who probably had their own problems and complications and heartbreaks. And for the first time in 8 years, I felt like I could breathe. My phone was buzzing. Text messages from David, probably, full of apologies and explanations and promises to make things right. I turned it off without reading them. Whatever he had to say, I wasn't ready to hear it. Maybe I never would be. I called room service and ordered a bottle of wine and the most expensive dinner on the menu. Things I never would have indulged in when I was being the perfect, budget-conscious faculty wife. I ran a bath with the expensive hotel bath salts and soaked until my skin was wrinkled, and the burn on my wrist had faded to a faint pink mark that might have been imaginary. I thought about calling my sister, my mother, one of the few friends I still had after years of declining invitations, because David needed me for something more important. But I didn't want to explain, didn't want to justify my decision or defend my choice or listen to anyone tell me. That marriage requires compromise, and maybe I was being hasty, because I wasn't being hasty. If anything, I was 8 years too late. I slept better that night than I had in months. Sprawled across the entire bed without worrying about disturbing anyone. Without listening for the sound of David coming home late. From whatever he was really doing when he said he was working Dotton. The morning, I called a lawyer. Not the family lawyer who'd helped us with our wills and our mortgage paperwork, but someone who specialized in divorce. Someone who came highly recommended and had a reputation for protecting her clients' interests. The consultation fee was more than I'd usually spend on myself in a month. But I was quickly learning that investing in myself felt different from any other kind of spending. "What are your goals for this divorce?" she asked. Direct and no nonsense in a way that I found refreshing. After years of David's academic circumlocution, I wanted to be fast, clean, and final. I don't want alimony. I don't want to fight over assets. I just want out. She raised an eyebrow. That's unusually straightforward. Most people in your situation want to negotiate for the best possible settlement. I'm not most people. What about the spousal support? You've been married 8 years, and I assume you've been supporting his career during that time? I have been, but I don't want anything from him. I want to know that when this is over, we have no connection, no reason to communicate, no ongoing financial entanglements. I want to disappear from his life as completely as he's about to disappear from mine. She studied me for a long moment, and I could see her recalculating, trying to understand why someone would walk away from a marriage without fighting for what most people would consider fair compensation for their contributions. Are you sure about this? Once we file these papers, once this process begins, it's going to be very difficult to change your mind. I've never been more sure of anything in my life, and I meant it. Sitting in that sterile law office, signing papers that would legally end what had emotionally ended the moment. David asked me to give up my position for his lover. I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, excitement. Not the nervous anticipation of wondering whether I was making the right choice, but the deep, bone-level certainty that I was finally doing something for myself. The lawyer had advised me to tell David about the divorce papers before he was served, but I decided against it. He would have time to prepare his arguments, to marshal his defenses, to figure out how to make me feel guilty for abandoning him when he needed me most. Better to let him be surprised, to feel for once what it was like to have someone else make decisions about his life without consulting him. I spent the week in a hotel making plans. I applied for jobs in 3 different states, reaching out to colleagues I'd lost touch with, people who remembered my work from graduate school and might be willing to give me a chance despite the gap in my resume. I updated my LinkedIn profile, highlighting the freelance work I'd been doing, the skills I'd developed while managing David's career that I'd never thought to claim as my own. I opened my own bank account, transferred my freelance earnings, and started the process of establishing credit in my name alone. I researched apartments in cities where I'd been offered phone interviews, looked at rental listings, like they were glimpses into possible futures. Most importantly, I stopped checking my phone. The messages from David had gone from apologetic to confused to angry to pleading. Voicemails where he alternated between trying to convince me that I was overreacting and accusing me of being selfish and unreasonable. Texts that swung wildly between promises to make things right and threats about what the divorce would cost me financially. I deleted them all without reading or listening to most of them. His panic, his desperate attempts to regain control of the narrative, his inability to understand that I was serious. None of it was my responsibility anymore. On Thursday afternoon, the process server found him at his office. I was in a coffee shop 3 blocks from campus, having what I now realized was probably my last meeting with a former colleague who'd been trying to convince me to apply for a lecturer position that had just opened up. A job that would have kept me in town, kept me in David's orbit, kept me available for whatever reconciliation he was probably already planning. I appreciate the offer, I told Dr. Martinez, but I'm looking for something that will let me start. completely fresh. Are you sure? The pay isn't bad, and you know the department. You'd be perfect for it. Perfect for staying small, staying safe, staying in the comfortable prison I'd built around myself. Perfect for being the woman who'd made a little fuss, but ultimately come to her senses and returned to her proper place. I'm sure. My phone rang while I was walking back to the hotel. David's number. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. Maybe curiosity about how he was handling being served with divorce papers. Maybe a morbid desire to hear him finally understand that I was serious. Sarah. His voice was tight, controlled, the tone he used when he was trying very hard not to lose his temper. We need to talk. No, we don't. Yes, we do. This is insane. You can't just file for divorce without even discussing it with me. I can, actually. I did. Over what? Over Natalie? Sarah, she doesn't mean anything to me. If this is about her, I can end it. We can work this out. She doesn't mean anything to him. Like I was supposed to find that comforting. Like the fact that he was willing to destroy our marriage for someone who meant nothing to him. Made it better somehow. This isn't about Natalie, I said, though we both knew that wasn't entirely true. This is about the fact that you asked me to give up the opportunity I've been waiting 8 years for so that your girlfriend could have it instead. This is about the fact that you thought I would say yes. It was just a temporary arrangement. You could reapply next year, or the year after. There will be other positions. Will there? Or will there be another Natalie? Another reason why it's not quite the right time. Another situation where the mature, reasonable thing for me to do is step aside and wait? That's not how it would be. That's exactly how it would be. Because that's how it's always been. My dreams have always been negotiable, David. My goals have always been something we could revisit later when it was more convenient. For you, Sarah, please, come home. Let's talk about this face to face. We can figure this out. Home. As if that house had ever been my home and not just the place where I'd served my sentence as the perfect academic wife. I am home, I said, looking up at the hotel where I'd been sleeping better and eating better and breathing easier than I had in years, or I will be, as soon as I figure out where home is going to be. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When he spoke again, his voice was different, smaller, more vulnerable than I'd heard it in years. I love you, Sarah. I know. I haven't been good at showing it, but I do love you. Please don't throw away 8 years over one mistake. One mistake. As if 8 years of taking me for granted was one mistake. As if the systematic erosion of my sense of self was one mistake. As if asking me to sacrifice my career for his convenience was one isolated error in judgment, and not the inevitable culmination of a pattern he'd been following since the day we got married. I'm not throwing away 8 years, I said. I'm refusing to throw away the rest of my life. I hung up before he could respond and turned off my phone again. Let him stew in the silence. Let him wonder what I was thinking, what I was planning, whether I was serious about this or just having some kind of breakdown that he could wait out and eventually fix. Because that's what he thought this was, I realized, a breakdown. A temporary insanity that would pass once I came to my senses and remembered how much I needed him. How lucky I was to be married to someone so successful and important. He thought I was having a moment of rebellion that would burn itself out. Once I realized how difficult it would be to rebuild my life from scratch, he was wrong. Friday morning, I got a call from a university in Oregon. They wanted to schedule a video interview for a position that was perfect for me. A job that would let me use all the skills I developed over the past 8 years, while giving me the independence and respect I'd been craving. The salary was more than I'd ever made in my life, and the benefits package was better than anything David's institution offered. I scheduled the interview for the following week, and spent the weekend preparing, researching the department, practicing, Answers to questions I hadn't had to think about in years. Questions about my goals, my vision for my career, what I wanted to accomplish in the next 5 years. It felt strange and wonderful to think about myself in future tense, to imagine a life that wasn't defined by someone else's needs and priorities. The interview went better than I dared to hope. The search committee was impressed by my experience, my skills, my perspective as someone who'd spent years working behind the scenes in academia. They didn't ask about my husband, or whether I'd be able to relocate, or any of the subtle questions that usually got asked of academic-wise. They treated me like a professional, a colleague, someone whose expertise was valuable in its own right. They offered me the job 3 days later. I accepted immediately, without calling David to discuss it, without agonizing over whether I was making the right choice. I felt like someone who'd been holding her breath underwater for 8 years, and finally broke the surface gasping and grateful and alive. I called the lawyer to tell her I'd be moving out of state, which would expedite the divorce proceedings. I called the hotel to extend my stay for another week while I made arrangements. I called a moving company to schedule a pickup for the few things I wanted to take from the house. What I didn't do was call David. He found out about the job the way he found out about most things that mattered in my life, accidentally, peripherally, as a side effect of his own concerns. One of his colleagues mentioned seeing my name on a university website, congratulating me on my new position, asking if this meant he'd be looking for jobs in Oregon too. The text started immediately, angry, desperate, confused messages that I read without responding to. How could I take a job without discussing it with him? How could I move across the country without even telling him I was considering it? What about our marriage, our life together, our commitments to each other? The irony was almost funny. Where had his commitment been when he was sleeping with Natalie? Where had his commitment been when he asked me to sacrifice my career for her benefit? Where had his commitment been every single time my needs conflicted with his convenience? But I wasn't angry anymore. Anger required emotional investment, and I was done investing in David's feelings about my choices. I was done explaining myself, justifying my decisions, making my life smaller so that his could feel bigger. The moving truck came on a Tuesday morning. I'd given David a list of things I wanted to take, mostly books. Some furniture that had been mine before we married, personal items that had sentimental value. I'd been generous, probably more generous than I should have been. I didn't want his money or his property or anything that would tie us together after this was over. He was waiting in the driveway when the movers arrived. I hadn't seen him since the night I'd left, and I was surprised by how different he looked. Smaller, somehow. Older. There were lines around his eyes that I didn't remember, and his hair was messier than he usually kept it. He looked like a man who hadn't been sleeping well, who'd been surviving on coffee and stress and the growing realization that his perfectly controlled life was spiraling beyond his ability to manage it. Sarah. He stepped toward me as I got out of my rental car, and I saw the moment when he registered how I looked. Rested, confident, like someone who'd been making good decisions for herself, instead of constantly questioning whether she deserved to take up space in the world. David, you look good. Thank you. We stood there for a moment. Two people who'd shared a life and a bed and 8 years of dreams that had apparently never aligned the way I'd thought they did. The movers were already getting started, carrying boxes to the truck with professional efficiency, dismantling the carefully constructed life we'd built together into separate components that could be redistributed to different locations. Is there anything I can say to change your mind? He asked, and his voice was quieter than I'd expected. More defeated. No. What about counseling? What about trying to work through this together? David, you asked me to divorce you so your girlfriend could get a job. There's nothing to work through. I never meant for it to be permanent. You know that, right? The divorce was just supposed to be a formality. It is a formality. Just not the kind you were planning. He watched the movers for a while, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, his shoulders hunched like he was trying to make himself invisible. I wondered if this was the first time in his adult life that he'd been in a situation he couldn't control, couldn't negotiate his way out of, couldn't solve with the right combination of charm and logic and appeals to reason. I've ended things with Natalie, he said suddenly, like this was news I'd been waiting for. Like this changed anything fundamental about our situation. Okay, she didn't get the position anyway. The search committee decided to hire externally. Okay, Sarah, doesn't that matter to you at all? Don't you want to know what happened? I considered his question carefully. Did I want to know? Was there some part of me that was curious about how his grand plan had unraveled? Whether Natalie had been as devastated as I would have been if our positions had been reversed. Whether David had finally understood what it felt like to sacrifice something important for someone who didn't appreciate it. No, I said finally. I really don't. And I meant it. Their story, David's and Natalie's, whatever drama had played out between them after I left, was just another chapter in a book I was finished reading. Whatever lessons he'd learned, whatever consequences he was facing, whatever regrets he was carrying, none of it had anything to do with me anymore. The movers finished loading the truck faster than I'd expected. 8 years of marriage reduced to a few boxes and some furniture. That fit easily into a mid-sized moving van. It should have felt sad, maybe, or profound, but mostly it just felt efficient, clean. Like watching someone else's life being packed away, someone I'd known once but didn't need to keep in touch with. David followed me to my car when it was time to leave. Where will you go? Oregon. Will you? Would you consider staying in touch? Even just occasionally? I looked at him standing there in the driveway of the house we'd shared. The house where I'd slowly disappeared over the course of 8 years. Where I'd learned to make myself small and quiet and convenient. He looked genuinely lost, like someone who'd always known exactly what he wanted and suddenly found himself in a world where his certainty meant nothing. No, I said, and I was surprised by how easy it was to say, how final it sounded. I don't think that would be good for either of us. Sarah, David. I turned to face him fully. And I could see him registering something in my expression, some fundamental shift that he was finally beginning to understand. I forgive you. I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for. But I'm done being the person who waits around to see if you figure out how to love me, the way I deserve to be loved. I got in my car and drove away without looking back. The drive to Oregon took 3 days. I took my time. Stopping at places that looked interesting, eating at restaurants I'd never tried, sleeping in hotels that I chose based on nothing more than whether I liked the look of them. From the highway, for the first time in 8 years, I didn't have to consider anyone else's preferences or schedule or needs. I could stop when I wanted to stop, eat when I was hungry, drive as fast or as slow as felt right in the moment. It was intoxicating. My new apartment was small but bright, with big windows that looked out over a tree-lined street in a neighborhood full of coffee shops and bookstores and the kind of casual restaurants where you could eat alone without feeling conspicuous. I spent my first week exploring, learning the rhythms of a city that didn't know anything about my history, where I could reinvent myself from scratch. The job was everything I'd hoped it would be. Challenging, engaging, respected. My colleagues treated me like an expert, sought out my opinions, included me in decisions that mattered. I was good at it, better than I'd expected after so many years of working in David's shadow. It turned out that all those skills I'd developed managing his career, organizing, communicating, problem solving, seeing the big picture while handling the details, translated perfectly to my new role. I made friends slowly, but genuinely. People who knew me only as Sarah, not as David's wife, not as half of a couple, not as someone who'd sacrificed her dreams for love and then discovered that Love had never really been on the table. I bought furniture that I chose because I liked it, not because it matched David's aesthetic or fit his budget. I decorated my apartment with art that spoke to me, books that I wanted to read, plants that I enjoyed caring for. I learned to cook for one without feeling lonely, to go to movies by myself without feeling sorry for myself, to make decisions based entirely on what I wanted instead of what someone else needed. And slowly, gradually, I stopped thinking about David. Not completely, not all at once. For the first few months, I'd catch myself wondering what he was doing, whether he was dating someone new, whether he ever thought about me or regretted the choice that had ended our marriage. I'd find myself composing texts that I'd never send, imagining conversations where I'd tell him about my new life and he'd finally understand what he'd lost. But as time passed, those moments became less frequent. My new life filled up with new experiences, new relationships, new challenges that had nothing to do with my past. David became a character in a story I used to tell about myself, important to the plot, but not relevant to the current chapter. 6 months after I moved to Oregon, I got an email from him. Just a few lines, carefully neutral, asking how I was settling in, mentioning that the divorce had been finalized, hoping that I was well. There was something desperate underneath the casual tone, a yearning that I recognized because I'd felt it myself for so many years. The hope that I'd respond with warmth, that I'd open a door for him to walk back into my life, that I'd give him another chance to figure out how to appreciate what he'd had. I read the email twice, then deleted it without responding. A year later, I heard through mutual friends that he'd left the university, taken a position at a smaller school in another state. The rumors were vague and contradictory. Some said he'd been passed over for a promotion he'd expected. Others said he'd left voluntarily for personal reasons. I felt nothing when I heard the news. No satisfaction, no pity, no curiosity about the details. He'd become a stranger to me, someone whose life was happening parallel to mine without ever intersecting. I was promoted 18 months after I started my new job. The position came with a significant salary increase, more responsibility, and recognition that felt earned rather than granted as a favor to someone else. I celebrated by taking a vacation to Italy, something I'd always wanted to do but had never suggested, because David preferred more practical trips, places where he could present his research or network with colleagues or advance his career in some tangible way. Italy was beautiful. I spent 2 weeks wandering through museums and gardens and ancient streets, eating amazing food and drinking good wine and talking to strangers who knew nothing about my history. I bought myself a piece of jewelry that cost more than I'd ever spent on anything purely decorative. A necklace that caught the light in a way that made me feel elegant and confident and worth celebrating. On my last night in Rome, I was having dinner at a small restaurant near my hotel when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It was David. Somehow he'd gotten my new number, probably from my sister or my mother. People who still believed that divorced couples should maintain friendly contact for the sake of everyone's comfort. The message was long, rambling, full of apologies and explanations and pleas for a second chance. He'd made a mistake, he said. The biggest mistake of his life. He'd been an idiot, a fool, too blind to see what he'd had until it was gone. He'd learned so much about himself over the past years, grown in ways that would make him a better partner, a better man. He knew he didn't deserve my forgiveness, but he was hoping, if there was any chance at all, that we could talk. I read the message while eating gelato and watching couples stroll past. On the cobblestone street outside, young lovers holding hands, older couples walking with the comfortable familiarity of people who'd chosen each other every day. For decades, families with children running ahead and circling back like planets in orbit around their parents. Love, all these different versions of what partnership could look like. What love could be when it was mutual and respectful and real. I finished reading David's message and felt nothing. Not anger, not hurt, not even the faintest flicker of curiosity about what had finally made him realize what he'd lost. His words felt like they were written in a language I used to speak but had forgotten, addressed to a person I used to be but had outgrown. I deleted the message without responding and ordered another glass of wine. The waiter, a kind man in his 60s who'd been charming and attentive all evening, noticed me putting my phone away with what must have been obvious finality. Bad news, he asked in careful English. Old news, I said, and he nodded like he understood exactly what I meant. When I got back to Oregon, I blocked David's number. Not out of anger or spite, but out of self-protection. I'd worked hard to build this new life, this new version of myself, to let him chip away at it with periodic attempts to resurrect what we'd had. I owed him nothing, not even the courtesy of a response, because that's what I'd finally learned in those 2 years since I'd walked out of our kitchen, with oil burning my wrist and clarity burning through my mind. I didn't owe him my attention, my forgiveness, my emotional labor, or my time. I didn't owe him the chance to make amends or the opportunity to prove he'd changed, or the satisfaction of knowing that his apology had been received and considered. I owed him nothing, and that realization was the most liberating thing I'd ever experienced. My 3rd year in Oregon brought changes I'd never expected. I was offered a position on a prestigious national committee in my field, recognition that came with travel opportunities, and the chance to shape policy at the highest levels. I started dating someone, a colleague from another university who appreciated my intelligence and ambition, who saw my career as complementary to his own rather than competitive with it. Marcus was everything David had never been. Supportive without being condescending, successful without being selfish, confident enough in himself that he didn't need to diminish me to feel important. When I told him about my marriage, about David, about the choice that had led me to Oregon, he listened without trying to fix anything or offer solutions, or suggest that maybe there had been misunderstandings on both sides. He asked you to give up your dream job for his mistress, Marcus said when I finished the story, and he thought you'd say yes. He thought it was reasonable, a temporary sacrifice for the greater good. Whose greater good, exactly? Marcus understood what David never had, that love isn't about making yourself smaller, so someone else can feel bigger. It's about growing together, supporting each other's dreams, celebrating each other's successes without keeping score or demanding reciprocal sacrifices. I didn't move in with Marcus right away, didn't rush into anything that felt like the kind of all-consuming partnership I'd had with David. I learned to value my independence too much to surrender it quickly or completely. But I did let him into my life gradually, carefully, on terms that felt healthy and sustainable. On a Tuesday evening in late spring, almost 4 years after I'd left David, I was at home grading papers when my doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, and Marcus was out of town at a conference. So I checked the peephole before opening the door. It was David. He looked older, grayer, wearing a rumpled suit that suggested he'd traveled a long way without planning ahead. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there when I knew him, and something in his posture that spoke of defeats I knew nothing about. For a moment, I considered not opening the door. I could pretend I wasn't home, wait for him to leave, call the police if he lingered too long. But curiosity won out. Or maybe just the desire to close this chapter once and for all. I opened the door but didn't invite him in. Hello, David. Sarah. He seemed surprised that I'd answered, like he'd been preparing for rejection and hadn't planned what to say if I actually appeared. You look amazing. I did look amazing. I learned to dress for myself rather than for someone else's approval. Learned to carry myself like someone who belonged wherever she was standing. I'd cut my hair shorter, started wearing colors that I liked, bought clothes that fit my body and my personality instead of some ideal of what an academic wife should look like. What are you doing here? I needed to see you, to talk to you. I've been trying to reach you for months, but you changed your number and your email bounces back. And nobody would tell me where you were living. Nobody would tell him because I'd asked them not to. Because I'd made it clear to everyone we knew that I didn't want contact with him, didn't want updates about his life, didn't want to be part of whatever narrative he was constructing about our failed marriage. David, we don't have anything to talk about. Please. Just 5 minutes. I've driven 12 hours to get here. That was your choice. Sarah, I know I hurt you. I know I made mistakes. But I've changed. I've learned from what happened between us. I know I can be the husband you deserved. The husband I deserved. As if I was still waiting around for someone to fill that role. As if my life had been on hold for 4 years while I hoped for him to become a better man. I don't need a husband, I said. I have a life. What kind of life? Living alone. Working all the time. Pretending you don't miss. What we had. What we had. He still didn't understand that what we'd had was fundamentally broken. Built on inequality and maintained by my willingness to accept less than I deserved. He still thought our marriage had been something worth salvaging rather than something I needed to escape. I'm not pretending anything. I genuinely don't miss what we had. That's not true. We were happy, Sarah. We were good together. You were happy. I was useful. That's not fair. Fair. He wanted to talk about fair after asking me to sacrifice my career for his convenience. After expecting me to put my life on hold indefinitely while he figured out what he wanted. After showing up at my door uninvited to demand my attention. Because his own life hadn't turned out the way he'd planned. David, I'm going to say this once. Very clearly. So there's no confusion. I don't want to reconcile with you. I don't want to be friends with you. I don't want you to contact me again. In any way. For any reason. What we had is over. And it's never going to be unover. But I love you. No, you don't. You miss having someone who organized your life and managed your schedule and made you feel important. You miss having a support system that asked for nothing in return. You miss the convenience of marriage without the responsibility of being a real partner. That's not true. It is true. And even if it weren't true, even if you genuinely loved me the way you think you do, it wouldn't matter. Because I don't love you anymore. The words hung in the air between us, final and irreversible. I watched them land, watched him process what I was saying, watched the hope drain out of his face as he finally understood that this wasn't a negotiation, or a trial separation, or a temporary estrangement that could be fixed with the right combination of apologies and promises. You can't mean that. I can, and I do. David, you're not a bad person. I hope you find someone who makes you happy. Someone who wants the kind of relationship you have to offer. But that someone isn't me. Not anymore. Sarah, please, goodbye, David. I closed the door gently but firmly and turned the lock. I heard him standing there for a moment, probably trying to decide whether to knock again or call through the door, or make some other desperate attempt to change my mind. But eventually I heard his footsteps retreating, heard a car door slam, heard an engine start and fade away into the distance. I went back to grading papers like nothing had happened. Because nothing had happened, really. Just the final confirmation of a choice I'd made for years ago. The last punctuation mark on a story that had already ended. My phone rang an hour later. Marcus, calling from his hotel room to check in. How was your evening? He asked. Quiet, I said, and realized it was true. The confrontation with David hadn't shaken me or upset me, or made me question anything about the life I'd built. It had just been an interruption, like a wrong number or a door-to-door salesman. Something to handle efficiently before getting back to the things that actually mattered. I miss you, Marcus said. I miss you too. And I did. Not the desperate, anxious missing I'd felt during the last years of my marriage, when David's absence had made me question my worth and wonder what I'd done wrong. This was the clean, simple missing of someone whose presence added joy to my life without being necessary for my happiness. That was the difference between the woman I'd been and the woman I'd become. I learned to love from a place of fullness rather than emptiness, to choose partnership rather than dependence, to build a life that was complete on its own rather than half of something. That only worked when someone else filled in the missing pieces. David never contacted me again after that night. I heard through the academic grapevine that he'd remarried a few years later, someone younger who was apparently devoted to supporting his career. I felt nothing when I heard the news. No jealousy, no pity for his new wife, no satisfaction that he'd found exactly what he'd been looking for. His life had become irrelevant to mine. A story happening to someone I used to know. I married Marcus 5 years after moving to Oregon, in a small ceremony attended by the friends I'd made in my new life. People who knew me as I was now, not as I'd been, who celebrated my success and supported my ambitions and never made me feel like I should be grateful for basic respect and consideration. Our wedding was nothing like the elaborate affair David and I had planned when we were young and believed that love meant merging into one person, instead of two people choosing to walk parallel paths. Marcus and I exchanged vows that we'd written ourselves, promises to support each other's dreams while maintaining our individual identities, to grow together without losing ourselves, to love each other without keeping score. I thought about David that day, briefly, the way you might think about a book you'd read long ago when you see it on someone else's shelf. A story that had been important once but had no bearing on your current life. I wondered if he was happy with his new wife, if he'd learned to appreciate what he had while he had it, if he ever thought about the woman who'd walked away from him and never looked back. But the thoughts passed quickly, replaced by the immediate joy of the celebration, the laughter of friends, the feeling of Marcus's hand in mine as we danced to music we'd chosen together. 7 years after I'd left David standing in our kitchen, asking me to sacrifice my dreams for his convenience, I was promoted again. Department chair at one of the most prestigious universities in the country, a position that came with national recognition and the opportunity to shape the next generation of scholars in my field. The university threw a reception in my honor, a room full of colleagues and students and administrators who respected my work and valued my contributions. I gave a speech that night about resilience, about the importance of believing in yourself, even when others don't, about the power of walking away from situations that diminish you in order to find the places where you can flourish. I didn't mention David directly, but I thought about him as I spoke, about the choice he'd forced me to make that had ultimately led me to this moment. I'd sent him an invitation to that reception, not because I wanted him there, but because I wanted him to know where I'd ended up, what I'd built from the ashes of our marriage. I wanted him to understand, finally, what he'd lost when he'd underestimated me, what he'd given up when he'd chosen someone else's temporary convenience over my lifelong dreams. He didn't come, of course. But someone told me later that they'd seen his name on the guest list that wasn't checked off. And I imagined him holding that invitation, reading about my success, understanding too late what he'd had and what he'd thrown away. The thought gave me no satisfaction. I was beyond needing his recognition or his regret. I'd built a life that was mine, a career that fulfilled me, a marriage that supported and celebrated who I was rather than asking me to become someone smaller. I learned to love myself enough to leave situations that didn't serve me, to demand respect rather than settling for tolerance, to build my happiness on my own foundation rather than hoping someone else would provide. It standing at the podium that night, looking out at a room full of people who saw me as I truly was, I felt a deep, bone-level gratitude for the choice I'd made 7 years earlier, for the moment when hot oil had burned my skin and burned away my illusions, when I'd finally seen clearly enough to walk away from a life that was killing me slowly and move toward one that made me feel fully alive. I'd been reborn that night, in the kitchen, but not in some mystical sense. I had simply remembered who I was underneath all the compromises and accommodations and small sacrifices that had accumulated over 8 years. I remembered that I was worth more than I'd been settling for, that my dreams mattered as much as anyone else's. That love without respect is just elaborate manipulation. The woman who'd stood in that kitchen, absorbing oil burns and insults with equal resignation, was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, clearer, more certain of her own value. Someone who'd learned that the most powerful form of revenge is living well. That the deepest form of closure is moving forward without looking back. That the truest form of strength is knowing when to walk away. I'd walked away from David, from our marriage, from the life we'd built together, and I'd never regretted it for a single moment. Because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit that something isn't working and choose yourself instead of choosing to endure. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to accept less than you deserve, even when it means disappointing someone you care about. David had been stunned when I left, but his shock had been the shock of someone who'd never considered that I might have choices, might have agency, might have enough self-respect to refuse his proposal. He'd been counting on my compliance, my willingness to sacrifice myself for his benefit, my inability to imagine a life that didn't center around his needs. He'd been wrong about all of it. The oil burn on my wrist had healed within a week, leaving no scar, no permanent mark of that pivotal moment. But the clarity that had come with it had lasted, had grown stronger with time, had become the foundation of everything I'd built since. I touched my wrist sometimes, remembering, grateful for the pain that had woken me up to the truth about my life and given me the courage to change it. David had given me the greatest gift of my life when he'd asked me to step aside for his lover. He'd forced me to see clearly, to choose definitively, to stop waiting for someone else to value me and start valuing myself. He'd pushed me toward a life I never would have had the courage to seek on my own, a happiness I never would have believed I deserved. I should probably thank him for that someday, but I won't, because doing so would require breaking the silence that has become my peace, the distance that has become my freedom. Instead, I'll continue living the life he made possible by underestimating me. Continue building on the foundation of strength I discovered when he forced me to choose between his happiness and my own. One chose myself. I chose my dreams. I chose my future over our past. And every day since then has been proof that it was the right choice, the only choice. The choice that saved my life by ending the one I'd been living for someone else. The woman who cooked dinner, while her husband asked her to sacrifice her career for his mistress, is gone. The woman who believed that love meant making herself smaller so someone else could feel bigger is gone. The woman who waited 8 years for her turn, only to be told to wait longer, is gone. In her place stands someone who knows her worth, someone who chooses carefully, someone who understands that the most important relationship you'll ever have is the one with yourself. Someone who learned that sometimes you have to break your own heart to save your own life, and that the pain of leaving is nothing compared to the pain of staying where you're not valued. I am reborn, not in some supernatural sense, but in the most human way possible, through choice, through courage, through the simple revolutionary act of deciding that I deserve better, and then creating better for myself. David was stunned when I left, but he shouldn't have been. The signs were all there, in every small sacrifice I'd made, every dream I'd deferred, every time I'd chosen his comfort over my own fulfillment. He just hadn't been paying attention, but I had been. And when the moment came, when the oil burned my skin and the truth burned away my illusions, I was ready to walk away from everything I thought I wanted in order to find everything I actually needed, ready to be reborn as myself.